I'm Hannah Kaplan, and this is the WCS Wild audio podcast, where you'll find reported audio stories covering the latest news and newsmakers from the Wildlife Conservation Society's Global Conservation Program, Zoos and Aquarium, and their many partners. We've got a great show today, so let's get to it. This month, governments from around the world will gather in Campo Grande, Brazil, for the triennial Conference of Parties to the Convention on Migratory Species, or CMS. It's a treaty focused on animals that cross borders: birds, whales and sharks, big cats, freshwater fish, that no one country can conserve alone. As the meeting approaches, WCS Wild Audio's Nat Moss spoke to CMS Executive Secretary Amy Fraenkel about the state of the world's migratory species and what's at stake at this year's conference.
The Convention on Migratory Species was founded in the 1970s around a simple but powerful idea. If wildlife moves across international borders, conservation must do so as well. CMS now works with governments around the world to coordinate protections for species that migrate between countries, continents, and oceans. For Amy Fraenkel, that priority of cross-border cooperation has defined her career.
From a very young age, I cared about nature. I also wanted to be a lawyer. I was more focused on U.S. and domestic issues, but I actually won a fellowship to study abroad for a year called the Watson Fellowship, and got very interested in topics where you need to bring countries together in order to succeed. You cannot solve this issue alone.
Before the previous Conference of the Parties, or COP as these triennial global meetings are known, CMS released the first ever State of the World's Migratory Species report, a global assessment of roughly 1,200 species listed under the convention and thousands more worldwide. It was designed as a stocktake. How are migratory species actually doing, and where should governments focus next? The findings were sobering. Global extinction risk is rising. Nearly half of CMS-listed species are in decline. And perhaps most striking, the single largest threat facing migratory species is not habitat loss.
We issued in 2024 the first ever report that focuses on the status and the trends of migratory species of animals. And it was very important that we do this because we have a mandate to undertake conservation of these species and their habitats, and yet we had not done that stock take to see how are these species doing. The report found that of the species listed under the treaty, about 44% were undergoing population declines.
For decades, habitat loss has been understood as the primary driver of biodiversity decline, and for many species it still is. But the CMS report revealed something unexpected. For migratory species, overexploitation now ranks as the top threat.
The conventional wisdom had been that the largest threat to biodiversity is, in fact, habitat loss. And that comes from agriculture and other infrastructure development. But in the case of migratory species, while that is one of the top threats, for some species, overexploitation, which includes both directed taking or hunting, as well as bycatch, for example, in the fisheries world, is actually the number one threat.
International wildlife trade is governed primarily by CITES, the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. But what this report made clear is that the bigger gap lies elsewhere, in domestic pressure. Hunting for food, retaliation killing, local markets, and incidental capture, often within national borders, are driving declines that have not received the same global attention. And that realization is now reshaping CMS's agenda.
I raised it actually at our scientific council meeting a number of years ago, and I wasn't sure how the parties would respond. It was a bit of a risk. I said, actually, we're not focusing enough on this topic of taking of species, not for international trade, but for use within the country. And the parties completely agreed. And they said, yes, this is a gap and we need to address it. So at our last meeting, our COP in Uzbekistan in 2024, the COP adopted a very strong resolution, and it called on us, the CMS Secretariat, to do quite a lot of ambitious work. And that work includes developing a global initiative that can help leverage existing work and new resources to tried to actually address this issue of illegal or unsustainable taking related to domestic use.
If some of the greatest pressures on species today occur domestically, those pressures nevertheless play out across landscapes and river basins that are not defined by national borders, and in iconic species like the jaguar, whose historic range stretches from the southern United States through Central America and deep into South America. Jaguars are already listed under CMS, but protecting them requires more than prohibiting hunting. It requires intact landscapes that allow these big cats to move across ranges that can encompass as much as 130 square kilometers, while avoiding conflict with people trying to protect their livestock from becoming the jaguar's next prey.
The jaguar is a great example of how there can be multiple threats to a species.
And it's an example, says Amy, that captures the way in which those threats are often interconnected.
One challenge is pressures on habitat. So destruction and fragmentation due to roads, due to agriculture, just human development. And when you lose that natural area and you lose the connectivity, it also can bring those animals closer to human activities. So that also means an increase, unfortunately, in human-wildlife conflict.
That loss of connected landscapes is not unique to jaguars. It's a defining challenge for migratory species worldwide. Birds, marine mammals, and terrestrial mammals all depend on networks of breeding grounds, feeding areas, and stopover sites that often span borders. Conservation cannot function as isolated patches. It requires corridors and cooperation.
Migratory species of animals need to have different sites that they can access throughout their lifetimes. That's their migratory, meaning that they regularly are on the move. Many people know species such as birds that in the winters, they move. We need to understand what are the most important habitats for these migratory species. And then we have to look at, can they access those sites? Are they safe? Are they under pressure? So it's both identifying this network of areas that are vital for the survival of migratory species, as well as what are the impediments to them reaching those and using those sites. So it's a very interesting approach to nature conservation.
Freshwater systems may present the most urgent case of all. An analysis co-authored by WCS found that fish species are faring the worst among CMS-listed species, with 97% in trouble. In river basins like the Amazon, conservation intersects directly with infrastructure development, hydropower, and food security. The challenge is not choosing between people and wildlife, but designing systems that sustain both without collapsing the ecological foundation they depend on.
So at CMS COP15, we are going to have a big focus on freshwater fish. And this is a big deal. We haven't had such a focus on that group of species in the past. And one thing that will happen is, in fact, there'll be some new species that get proposed for listing onto the convention. Another is this multi-species action plan for Amazonian migratory catfish. And we're also going to be having a major new science report launched at the COP, which highlights all over the world which migratory fish species are in freshwater. So of the freshwater fish species, which are migratory and which might warrant protection under CMS. And it's important because our report issued in 24 found that actually of all of the species, the ones that are worse off are fish species. So I'm very pleased to see that after that report was issued, parties stood up and took notice. And that is why I believe there's so much focus on it at this COP. So it means that the science that we brought to the world is actually resulting in action.
When ecosystems are stressed, whether by overexploitation, fragmentation, or infrastructure that disrupts natural systems, the impacts don't stop with wildlife. Habitat destruction and closer contact between people and animals also increase the risk of pathogen spillover, a lesson underscored globally in recent years, and that will be a focus at the coming CMS COP.
When we had the pandemic several years ago, we did a big study and found, in fact, that the pressures on migratory species are the same pressures that lead to an increased risk of pathogen spillover. So if you look at, for example, destruction of habitat, destruction of connectivity, and you're bringing humans closer to wildlife, you're increasing the chance of a spillover.
Looking ahead to the next CMS COP in 2029, when governments meet again, the question will not be simply how many species were listed or how many resolutions were passed this month in Campo Grande. It will be whether countries began addressing the pressures that science has already identified, and whether that shift has changed the trajectory for migratory species. One of the COP15 outcomes anticipated by Amy Fraenkel is a new initiative specifically addressing illegal and unsustainable taking of migratory species.
For me, the great success 3 years from now would be to see this initiative being implemented, being advanced, so that we bring the extinction risk down, we improve the long-term viability of wildlife, and it benefits our ecosystems and it benefits humans. So it's very much a multiple win scenario, and it's doable. That's the thing. It's not rocket science. We know what has to happen. It's, if you think of a fishery, it's very simple, or the tragedy of the commons, where if everyone takes something out and then it's all gone, that's actually not a great result. So before we take out that last fish, we need to make sure that we stop and we take the actions needed to ensure a long-term future for migratory species of animals.
Migratory species connect continents, they connect ecosystems, and they connect people. We know working through cooperation encourages solutions, and the work achieved in Brazil this March is poised to nurture more of them. You can follow all the action at our website at wcs.org. For WCS Wild Audio, I'm Nat Moss.
Today's episode was produced and reported by Nat Moss, with help from Dan Rosen and Hannah Kaplan. The WCS Wild Audio Podcast is a production of the Wildlife Conservation Society. Stay tuned for our next episode, and don't forget to follow, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts.